On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold, effectively ending the gold standard and severing the last connection between the US dollar and any tangible asset. And what Nixon called a temporary measure to protect the dollar became permanent. And in the 54 years since that day, the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power, meaning that what cost $1 in 1971 now costs $50, and your savings have been systematically destroyed through inflation that Nixon's decision made inevitable. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Nixon did on August 15, 1971, why closing the gold window destroyed the value of every dollar you earn and save, how this one decision created the permanent inflation that's been eating away at your wealth for over half a century, and why this moment represents the greatest betrayal of the American people by their government in modern history. Because once you understand that Nixon didn't close the gold window to save the dollar, but to allow unlimited money printing that benefits government and banks while destroying your savings, you'll understand why everything keeps getting more expensive, why your parents could buy a house on one income while you can't afford rent on two incomes, why wages haven't kept up with the cost of living, and why this system of monetary theft will never be reversed because the people who benefit from inflation control the government. Before we explain what Nixon did in 1971, we need to understand what the gold standard was and why it prevented the government from printing unlimited money, because this constraint is exactly what Nixon wanted to remove. The gold standard meant that every dollar could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, and the U.S. government promised to convert dollars to gold at $35 per ounce for foreign central banks. And this meant the government couldn't print unlimited dollars because if they printed too many dollars, foreign countries would demand gold in exchange, and the U.S. gold reserves would be depleted. So the gold standard acted as a constraint on money printing. The government could only issue as many dollars as they had gold to back them, and this protected the value of the dollar because everyone knew that dollars were backed by something real, by a physical metal that couldn't be created out of thin air. Under the Bretton Woods system created in 1944, the dollar was the world's reserve currency, and other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. So the entire global monetary system was ultimately backed by gold through the dollar. And this system worked well for 25 years, from 1944 to 1968, because the US had most of the world's gold, about 20,000 tons stored at Fort Knox in the New York Federal Reserve. But by the late 1960s, the system was breaking down because the US was printing too many dollars to fund the Vietnam War and President Johnson's Great Society programs, and foreign countries, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, and US gold reserves fell from 20,000 tons in 1950 to 8,000 tons in 1971. And Nixon faced a choice: either stop printing money and balance the budget, which would require cutting spending and raising taxes, or close the gold window and allow unlimited money printing. And Nixon chose the latter. He chose to betray the promise that had backed the dollar since Bretton Woods, and he did it on a Sunday night without consulting Congress or foreign allies, and he called it temporary, but it's been permanent for 54 years. Here's exactly what Nixon announced on August 15, 1971, at 9 p.m. in a televised address that interrupted Bonanza, and these are his actual words, and understanding what he said versus what he meant will show you how the betrayal was framed as protection. Nixon said, quote, "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interests of the United States," end quote. And notice the word temporarily. Nixon claimed this was a temporary measure, but it's been 54 years and the gold window has never been reopened. And notice he said suspend, not end, making it sound reversible when it wasn't. And notice he framed it as protecting the dollar, when actually he was destroying the constraint that protected the dollar's value. Nixon also said, quote, "The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy, and the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators," end quote. And this framing was brilliant propaganda. Nixon made it sound like he was defending the dollar against speculators, when actually the speculators were foreign central banks like France who were demanding the gold that the US had promised them. And these weren't speculators. These were creditors collecting on a debt. But Nixon framed them as villains to justify breaking America's promise. And Nixon said the American economy was the strongest in the world, so the dollar should be strong. But this ignored that currency strength comes from scarcity, not from economic size, and by removing the gold constraint, Nixon ensured the dollar would become abundant and therefore weak. And this is exactly what happened. The dollar lost 98% of its value over the next 50 years. Let me show you the exact numbers of how much value the dollar has lost since Nixon closed the gold window. And these numbers prove that Nixon's decision destroyed your purchasing power systematically over 5 decades. In 1971, the median U.S. home price was $28,000. Today, the median home price is $420,000. That's a 15-fold increase, not because houses got 15 times better, but because the dollar lost value. In 1971, a new car cost $3,500. Today, the average new car costs $48,000, a 14-fold increase. In 1971, a gallon of gas cost 36 cents. Today, it costs $3.50, a 10-fold increase. In 1971, college tuition at a public university was $400 per year. Today, it's $11,000 per year, a 28-fold increase. In 1971, a loaf of bread cost 25 cents. Today, it costs $2.50, a 10-fold increase. In 1971, the median household income was $10,000. Today, it's $75,000, a 7.5-fold increase. And notice that income only increased 7.5 times while houses increased 15 times, cars 14 times, and college 28 times, which means that even though your income went up, you're poorer relative to the cost of living. And this is the direct result of Nixon's decision to allow unlimited money printing, because when the government prints money, prices go up faster than wages, and you get poorer in real terms even if your nominal income increases. What would you do if you discovered that a decision made in 1971 by a president who resigned in disgrace has been stealing your wealth for your entire life? That the reason you can't afford a house while your parents bought one easily is because Nixon destroyed the dollar's value, that the inflation you're experiencing right now isn't caused by supply chains or corporate greed, but is the inevitable result of a monetary system designed to transfer wealth from savers to the government, and that this theft will continue forever because the people who benefit from inflation are the ones who control the system. This is the reality every American lives in, and most people don't understand that the decline in their standard of living traces directly back to August 15th, 1971. If you're starting to understand that Nixon's closing of the gold window wasn't a temporary measure to protect the dollar, but was a permanent betrayal that allowed unlimited money printing, that the 98% loss in the dollar's value over 50 years isn't an accident, but is the designed consequence of removing the gold constraint, and that this is why your generation is poorer than your parents' generation, despite working harder and being more educated, then stay with me, because what comes next will show you the exact mechanism of how removing the gold standard creates inflation, why inflation is a hidden tax that steals from savers and wage earners, and why this system will never be reversed because the government and banks profit from inflation while you pay the cost. Subscribe now because very few channels will explain how a decision made in 1971 destroyed the American middle class, and understanding this is essential to protecting whatever wealth you have left. Here's exactly how the gold standard prevented inflation and why removing it made inflation permanent and inevitable. And this is the key to understanding why everything keeps getting more expensive. Under the gold standard, the government could only create new dollars if they had gold to back them. So if the government wanted to spend more money, they had 3 options: raise taxes, which is politically unpopular, borrow money by issuing bonds, which requires paying interest, or acquire more gold, which is difficult. And these constraints meant that government spending was limited, and the money supply couldn't grow much faster than the economy, so prices stayed relatively stable. In fact, from 1800 to 1971, prices in America barely changed. There were periods of inflation and deflation, but over the long term, prices were stable because the money supply was tied to gold, and this meant that if you saved $1,000 in 1850, that $1,000 would buy approximately the same amount of goods in 1950, 100 years later, because the dollar's value was stable. But once Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the government could create unlimited dollars without needing gold, and this is called fiat currency that exists by government decree rather than being backed by anything physical, and with no constraint on money creation. The government could spend unlimited amounts by simply printing dollars. And this is exactly what happened. In 1971, the total US money supply M2 was $600 billion. Today it's $22 trillion. That's a 37-fold increase in the money supply. And when you increase the supply of anything, its value decreases. This is basic economics. So increasing the money supply 37 times decreased the value of each dollar. And this is why prices have increased 10 to 28 times for various goods, because there are 37 times more dollars chasing roughly the same amount of goods, so prices must rise. Here's why inflation is actually a hidden tax that the government uses to steal your wealth, and understanding this will change how you think about money forever. When the government prints new money, those new dollars dilute the value of all existing dollars, so if you have $10,000 in savings and the government doubles the money supply, your $10,000 can now buy only half as much. You didn't get taxed directly, but you lost half your purchasing power, and this is inflation, and it's a tax because the government benefits at your expense. When the government prints $1 trillion new dollars, they can spend that $1 trillion at today's prices before inflation kicks in. But by the time that new money circulates through the economy, prices have risen and your savings buy less. So the government got real goods and services with the new money, and you lost purchasing power on your existing money. It's a transfer of wealth from you to the government. And the insidious part is that most people don't understand it's happening. If the government raised income taxes by 10%, everyone would notice and complain. But if the government prints money and causes 10% inflation, most people blame corporations or supply chains rather than understanding the government stole their wealth through money printing. And this is why governments love inflation. It's a hidden tax that people don't recognize as a tax. Let me show you the specific numbers of how much wealth has been transferred from savers to the government through inflation since 1971. And this will prove that Nixon's betrayal wasn't a mistake, but was deliberate theft. In 1971, the total U.S. federal debt was $398 billion. Today it's $36 trillion. That's a 90-fold increase. And normally if you increase debt 90 times, you'd need to pay it back with money that has the same value as when you borrowed it. But through inflation, the government borrowed in 1971 dollars and is paying back in 2025 dollars that are worth only 2% as much. So the government has effectively defaulted on 98% of its debt through inflation. And who paid for this default? Savers, anyone who held dollars or dollar-denominated assets like bonds, saw their wealth decline by 98% in real terms, so the government stole 98% of the value of its debt from the people who lent it money. And this is legal because the government controls the currency. If you borrowed $1 million from your neighbor in 1971 and paid him back $1 million today, you'd be paying back only $20,000 in real value. Your neighbor would have been robbed. And this is exactly what the government has done to everyone who saved dollars or bought government bonds, and the numbers are staggering. The total amount stolen from savers through inflation since 1971 is approximately $40 trillion in real terms. This is the difference between what savers expected to have based on 1971 purchasing power versus what their dollars actually buy today. And this $40 trillion was transferred to the government and to banks who borrowed money and paid it back with devalued dollars. And this theft continues every year because inflation averages 3 to 4% officially. But real inflation as measured by shadow stats is closer to 8 to 10%. So every year your savings lose 8 to 10% of their purchasing power, and the government and banks benefit. Here's exactly what happened after Nixon closed the gold window, and why it proved that removing the gold standard causes inflation, because the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. In the 1970s, the decade after Nixon's decision, America experienced the worst inflation in its peacetime history. Inflation averaged 7% per year from 1971 to 1980, and in some years like 1974 and 1979, inflation hit double digits, over 10% per year, and this inflation was directly caused by the removal of the gold constraint, because with no limit on money printing, The government printed massive amounts of dollars to fund the Vietnam War, the welfare state, and budget deficits, and all those new dollars caused prices to skyrocket. Gas prices quadrupled during the 1970s, home prices tripled, food prices doubled, and wages couldn't keep up. So real wages adjusted for inflation, actually declined during the 1970s, meaning Americans got poorer despite working, and this era was called stagflation, stagnant economy plus inflation, and it was a direct result of Nixon's betrayal, and the Federal Reserve eventually had to raise interest rates to 20% in 1980 under Paul Volcker to bring inflation under control, and those high rates caused a severe recession, massive unemployment, and economic pain, so Nixon's decision to print unlimited money led to inflation, which led to high interest rates, which led to recession, and working Americans paid the price, while the government that caused the problem faced no consequences. Here are the arguments defenders make for why Nixon had to close the gold window and why every single argument is dishonest or misleading. Because the truth is Nixon had choices, but chose the path that benefited the government and hurt the people. They claim Nixon had no choice because the US was running out of gold and foreign countries were demanding redemption. But this is false. Nixon had the choice to balance the budget, stop printing money to fund the Vietnam War and Great Society programs, raise taxes, cut spending, and honor America's commitment to redeem dollars for gold. Yes, this would have been politically difficult and economically painful in the short term, but it would have preserved the dollar's value and prevented 50 years of inflation. Instead, Nixon chose the easy path, default on America's promise, allow unlimited money printing, and let future generations pay the price through inflation. So the claim that he had no choice is a lie. He had a choice and chose betrayal over responsibility. They claim that economic growth requires a flexible money supply and the gold standard was too rigid. But this is nonsense. America had the strongest economic growth in its history, from 1800 to 1971 under the gold standard. The Industrial Revolution, electrification, automobiles, aviation, computing, all happened under the gold standard. And the gold standard didn't prevent growth, it prevented inflation. And stable prices are better for real economic growth than inflation, because when prices are stable, people can plan for the future, save money, invest in long-term projects, whereas inflation creates uncertainty, punishes savers, and encourages speculation over production. They claim that fiat currency gives the Federal Reserve flexibility to respond to crises by printing money, but this flexibility is exactly the problem. The Fed has used this flexibility to bail out banks, inflate asset bubbles, create boom-bust cycles, and transfer wealth from savers to borrowers. And every crisis the Fed claims to solve with money printing just creates the next bigger crisis. The 2008 financial crisis was caused by the Fed printing too much money in the 2000s, and the Fed's response was to print even more money, creating the inflation we're experiencing now. So the flexibility to print unlimited money isn't a feature, it's a bug. It's the source of instability, not the solution. Let me show you how the end of the gold standard changed America from a saver nation to a debtor nation, and why this destruction of savings is Nixon's most damaging legacy. In 1971, before Nixon's decision, the average American household saved 10% of their income. Savings rates were high because people knew that dollars would hold their value. You could save $1,000 and know it would buy the same amount of goods in 10 or 20 years, so saving made sense. But after Nixon ended the gold standard and inflation became permanent, saving made no sense. If you save $1,000 and inflation is 7% per year, in 10 years your $1,000 will buy only $500 worth of goods. You lost half your purchasing power by saving, so rational people stopped saving and started spending and borrowing, because if dollars are losing value, better to spend them now rather than save them, and better to borrow money and pay it back with devalued dollars. And this is exactly what happened. The savings rate fell from 10% in the 1970s to near zero by the 2000s, and household debt exploded. In 1971, the average household had $5,000 in debt. Today it's $150,000, a 30-fold increase, and this shift from saving to debt is disastrous for individuals and for society. Savers build wealth and fund investment and entrepreneurship. Debtors are slaves to their creditors and live paycheck to paycheck. And Nixon's decision to destroy the dollar's value transformed America from a nation of savers and creditors to a nation of debtors and borrowers. And this benefits banks who lend money and get paid back in devalued dollars, and it benefits the government who borrows trillions and inflates away the debt. But it destroys the middle class who can't save and can't get ahead. Here's the proof that closing the gold window created permanent inflation by comparing inflation rates before and after 1971. And the data is unambiguous. From 1800 to 1971, 171 years under the gold standard, the average annual inflation rate in the United States was approximately zero. There were periods of inflation during wars and periods of deflation during recessions, but over the long term, prices were stable. In fact, prices in 1971 were roughly the same as prices in 1900, meaning zero inflation over 70 years. And this is because the gold standard constrained money printing. But from 1971 to today, 54 years after Nixon closed the gold window, the average annual inflation rate has been over 4%. And this doesn't sound like much, but compound 4% over 54 years, and you get a 98% loss in purchasing power. And the official 4% CPI understates real inflation, because the government changed how it calculates inflation in the 1980s and 1990s to make the numbers look better. If inflation were calculated using the original methodology, the rate would be 8 to 10% per year, which matches people's lived experience of how much more expensive everything has become. And this inflation is permanent. It doesn't stop. Every single year since 1971 has seen positive inflation, meaning every year your dollars buy less. And this is the direct result of removing the gold standard, which was the only constraint on money printing. So the data proves conclusively that Nixon's decision created permanent inflation. Here's why the gold window will never be reopened and the gold standard will never be restored. And understanding this will show you that the theft is permanent unless there's a complete systemic collapse. The government and banks benefit enormously from fiat currency and inflation. The government can spend unlimited amounts by printing money rather than raising taxes. This allows politicians to promise benefits to voters without the political pain of raising taxes, and it allows the government to fund wars and deficits without fiscal discipline, and the government can inflate away its debt, borrowing trillions and paying it back with devalued dollars. So returning to the gold standard would require the government to balance its budget, stop printing money and actually pay its debts in real value. And no politician will voluntarily give up the power to print money, because that power is how they stay in office, by promising spending without taxes. Banks benefit from fiat currency because they can borrow from the Fed at low rates and lend at higher rates, and they can create money through fractional reserve lending, and they benefit from inflation because they lend money and get paid back in devalued dollars, and banks fund political campaigns for both parties, so both Democrats and Republicans support the fiat currency system, and any politician who proposes returning to the gold standard is attacked as crazy or extreme, even though the gold standard worked for 170 years, and fiat currency has failed repeatedly throughout history. And the media, which is owned by corporations that benefit from cheap money, will never advocate for sound money. So there's a complete alignment of government, banks, corporations, and media to preserve the fiat currency system that allows inflation, and the only people who lose are savers and wage earners who have no political power. So the system will never be reformed voluntarily. It will only end when the currency collapses completely, as has happened to every fiat currency in history, and at that point, we'll likely return to some form of gold or hard money standard, but only after immense economic pain. Let me show you how to protect yourself from the inflation that Nixon's decision made permanent, because understanding the problem is useless unless you can defend your wealth. The key insight is that inflation destroys cash and benefits hard assets, so the strategy is to minimize cash holdings and maximize hard asset holdings. Hard assets are things that can't be printed, things that have intrinsic value, independent of currency. The best hard assets are gold and silver, which have been money for 5,000 years and can't be created by governments. Since 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, gold has increased from $35 per ounce to $2,700 per ounce, a 77-fold increase, which means if you held gold instead of dollars since 1971, you'd be 77 times richer in dollar terms. And in real purchasing power terms, you'd have preserved your wealth because gold maintains its value while dollars lose value. Other hard assets include real estate, which generally keeps up with inflation because property is finite and tangible, productive assets like businesses and stocks, which can raise prices to match inflation, and commodities like oil, farmland, and industrial metals, which have real-world utility. The worst thing you can hold during inflation is cash and bonds, because these are denominated in dollars that are losing value. So if you hold $10,000 in a savings account earning 1% interest, but inflation is 4%, you're losing 3% per year in real terms. And if real inflation is 10%, as ShadowStats suggests, you're losing 9% per year. So the optimal strategy is to hold only enough cash for immediate expenses, maybe 3 to 6 months of living expenses, and invest everything else in hard assets that preserve purchasing power. And this is what rich people and institutions do. They don't hold cash, they hold assets. And this is why the rich get richer during inflation while wage earners get poorer, because the rich hold assets that appreciate while workers hold dollars that depreciate. Now you understand exactly what Nixon did on August 15, 1971, when he closed the gold window and ended the gold standard. He removed the only constraint on government money printing and made inflation permanent and inevitable. And you understand that the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power in the 54 years since that decision, meaning you need $50 today to buy what $1 bought in 1971. And you understand that this inflation is not an accident, but is the designed consequence of removing the gold backing, because without gold to back dollars, the government can print unlimited money, and more dollars means each dollar is worth less. And you understand that inflation is a hidden tax that transfers wealth from savers to the government and banks, because when the government prints money, your savings lose purchasing power while the government can spend the new money. And you understand that Nixon's decision destroyed the American middle class by making saving impossible and debt inevitable, because why save dollars that lose value when you can borrow dollars and pay back devalued dollars? And you understand that this system will never be reversed, because the government and banks profit from inflation while you pay the cost, and the only people who can protect themselves are those who hold hard assets like gold instead of cash. And you understand that this betrayal continues every day as your wages buy less and your savings erode, and it will continue until the dollar collapses completely or until enough people understand the theft and demand sound money. If this explanation of how Nixon's closing of the gold window in 1971 destroyed your purchasing power and created permanent inflation has made you understand why everything keeps getting more expensive, why your generation can't afford what your parents could afford, why your savings are worthless, and why this theft will never stop under the current system, then you need to see what we reveal next, because Nixon's betrayal is just one part of a larger pattern of monetary theft. Subscribe now and prepare to discover how the Federal Reserve created $9 trillion from nothing in 2008 through 2020 and gave it to Wall Street. While you got nothing, how the crime of 1873 demonetized silver and destroyed the West, how FDR confiscated gold in 1933 and made private ownership illegal, and how every monetary crisis follows the same pattern. Government removes sound money, prints unlimited currency, creates inflation, transfers wealth from the middle class to the banks, and then does it again in the next crisis. Because once you understand that the monetary system is designed to steal your wealth through inflation, and that Nixon's 1971 decision was a deliberate betrayal, not an accident, you'll understand why you'll never get ahead by working harder or saving more under this system, why the next generation will be poorer than this generation, why the dollar will eventually collapse just like every fiat currency in history has collapsed, and why the only protection is to hold hard assets that governments can't print, because the theft continues every day, the inflation never stops, and Nixon's betrayal becomes more complete with each dollar that loses value.